Mr. Chairman, fellow Toastmasters. I'm going to tell you a story about a wonderful piece of music that was composed over 400 years ago by a man called Rory Dall O'Carolan, Dall meaning blind. And this piece, over those 4 centuries, has come down to us today. It was recorded by Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash. Cliff Richards sang it in front of 100,000 people in Italy. So how did this piece of music come about? Well, the story starts back in the 9 Years' War in 1591 to 1600. You had this man here, Hugh O'Neill, the great O'Neill, and he, with another Hugh, Red Hugh O'Donnell, and Hugh Maguire, the 3 Hugheses, took on the best armies that Queen Elizabeth could throw at them. That's Queen Elizabeth I. The first major battle, and really serious, thousands involved, the Battle of the Yellow Ford, and they won. Hugh O'Neill won that battle. And this spread all over Europe, this news. So much so that the King of Spain sent 3 ships to O'Neill so that one would get through with the message. Don't negotiate with the English. We're going to send you help. But they didn't. They fought on, but they were worn down by a much more powerful armies in England. They won some battles in the Turlough Mountains. And then, in 1601, the Spanish fleet was off the coast of Kinsale. Most of it scattered under tremendous storms. But they did capture Kinsale for a period. O'Neill and O'Donnell came down from the north. If only they had landed in the north where the rebellion was strong. And to come down from the north with no roads, pulling their cannon in stormy, wet weather. And when they got to Kinsale, the flint wouldn't light for their cannon, and they were beaten. And they went back to the north, and some years later, you had the flight of the Earls, when Hugh O'Neill and their families, the royalty of Ulster, went on a tiny little ship, 100 of them, a tiny little ship out to the Atlantic to go to Europe for help. And this was an amazing period, but what has this to do with a piece of music? Well, Rory Dall O'Carolan was the harper to Hugh O'Neill. He would have been a minor chieftain in his own right, except he was blind. The centre of Derry, from Limavady down Coleraine, his clan owned that, equivalent to 1/10 of the size of Mayo. And when these chieftains left, he was high and dry, because they had to go over the Alps and they couldn't bring a blind man. He was very bright. He was the best composer in his lifetime, a brilliant player on the harp. So he decided to go to Scotland, where he had been on a few visits, and he thought he might be welcome. So he, with a number of other gentlemen, and he considered himself a gentleman, which he was from centuries back, the family. And when he arrived in Scotland, his fame spread. He composed for all the big families in Scotland, so much so that the King of Scotland, this next man, James VI, and James VI, he later became James I of England, joining both kingdoms, requested that Rory Dall would play for him in this building, Holyrood Palace, which exists today, where It's the residence of the kings of Scotland, and Queen Elizabeth, when she goes up there, stays there yet. So Rory Dall was brought to Holyrood Palace to play for the king. Now Rory Dall had no time for King James, because one of his benefactor and his own lands was being taken over by James VI and planted by Presbyterians, Protestants, and his benefactor's lands were all being taken over. But yet he was in a foreign land, so he went and he played for the king and his entourage. He played wonderful airs, Port the Hull, Port Gordon, Port Lennox, and he played the very special air I am talking about, you'll hear more about later. And when he had finished, all the audience clapped. And the king stood up, and all the audience stood up. And he came over to Rory Dall, and he put his hand on his shoulder by way of commendation for his performance. Rory Dall said nothing. And a courtier came over and whispered in his ear in Gaelic, "That was the King of Scotland that put his hand on your shoulder." And Rory Dall said, "A greater man than he often put his hand on my shoulder." And when it was translated for James VI, he was taken aback and he said, "Who might that be?" And he said, "O'Neill, sir." Now we don't know what happened after that. But he lived and travelled all over Scotland. And one day he came to this castle, Eglinton Castle. And it was a wet day, and when he got there, he didn't look too much. And Lady Eglinton, when she saw him, didn't think much of him. And she demanded that he play for her. And he didn't like her attitude. And he said to the guide, "We're leaving." And she was taken aback at this. Who did he think he is? And it was explained to her that he was the great harp. He was the harper to the great O'Neill. He played for the King of Scotland. She apologised and called him back, and they became great friends. And then, while they were friends, he wrote this beautiful air and he was making up to her, called "Toward Them the Love, Give You Me Your Hand." Now Rory Dall lived to be a great age, and he died in Eglinton Castle and is buried in Skye. He died, but his music lived on. And our special air and a number of others percolated down into Ireland. And 30 years later, we had a great composer, Turlough O'Carolan, also a blind harper. And when Turlough O'Carolan heard this great air, he was taken. And he had composed hundreds of pieces. 220 have survived to today. And Turlough O'Carolan said, If only he had composed that piece, he'd swap all his compositions for that piece, to say he had composed it. Turlough O'Carolan was also a poet, and he composed a piece, I think it was Port Gordon that he adopted, and he wrote it for Charles O'Donnell of Rossturk, who was marrying a Miss Moore. And he wrote the words which we have today in Gaelic. And he called it Shallock Bela Shoney, the hawk of Ballyshannon, where the O'Donnells had come. The next we find of our piece coming down is in 1792. It's not widely known, but the leaders in Belfast, the business leaders, were very nationalistic, even though they were Presbyterian. And they wanted to split with England. They were very culturally Irish, and they wanted to save the harp. So they sponsored a harp competition in 1792. The amazing thing they did, and wonderful for us, that they employed a man, Edward Bunting, to record these harpists. Some of them were very old, 90 years of age. They felt it was dying out. And Bunting recorded the music as instructed. And he also recorded biographies from them. Now, Bunting, as a result of this, he got very interested in music. And he was employed by Henry Joy McCracken and his sister Anne to come down to Mayo and the West, collecting our music. They saw us as so isolated that the music would be pure. And they came down along the coast, Bunting, but he couldn't speak Gaelic. So he employed a man called Patrick Lynch, who could, with fluent and beautiful handwriting. And they collected over 100 airs in Westport and up and down the coast, saving it for us forever. And he was also friendly with these leaders, Henry Joy McCracken, Thomas Russell. And he used to play for them. And let's see now. He played pieces, and this went on for quite a period in the rebellion. And they had a concert one night, and before long, 3 of the people there, Henry Joy, they were Wolfe Tone. And Wolfe Tone was a great friend of theirs, even though he came from Dublin. And he was going abroad. And Bunting played a piece of music, including our air, and another one called The Parting of Friends. So much so that Wolfe Tone's wife broke down crying. And little did she realize that 3 of that small group would be hung for their involvement in 1798. The next we hear of the air was in 1851. There was a lady called Jane Ross going down a town in Derry called Lemavady. And she was going down the street, it was only a small place that time. And she heard this wonderful air, the air I'm talking about, being played by a blind fiddler, Jenny McCurry. She was taken with it. She took out her notebook and she could write down music by notation from the air. And she got him to play it a number of times until she had it note perfect. She was in contact with other musicians, and she sent her music, and I'll show you now. She sent the music to this man, George Petrie. Now, George Petrie was an amazing man, my hero. He was of Protestant Scottish stock. He said his blood was half Irish, but his heart was 100%. He had written the history of Tara. He'd researched the purpose of the Round Towers. He was a brilliant artist, but his greatest achievement, in my view, was his saving of Irish music. And so our ear got into his collection that was printed in 1857. Now, if any of us in this room saved 50 pieces from extension, we would think we did a great job. Well, he saved over 1,600 pieces for us. And so our music came down to the next century. Let's see, have I his picture here? And this was Pádraig Pearse in 1904. His sister played the harp. And they used to have little parties, and they loved our air. Now, almost in parallel was a lady called Margaret Weatherly. She was Irish, married to an Englishman. And they immigrated to America, where she came across this air, probably from Petrie's book. And she loved it. And she was home visiting her brother-in-law, Fred Weatherly. And Fred was a barrister, but he was very interested. He was a brilliant composer of lyrics and poems. And when he heard the air, he said to Margaret, I have a lyric already written that'll go with this music. Slight adjustment. So he joined the words with the music, sold it in 1910, he published it and made a fortune. Never acknowledged Margaret's contribution. She died poor. The next we hear of it is Elvis Presley recording this. And Elvis said this piece must have been written by the angels. You had Mahalia Jackson, a jazz pianist, record it. Paul Robeson, a tenor. When Elvis Presley died, it was played at his funeral. When Jack Kennedy was assassinated, it was played at his funeral. Princess Diane died, played at her funeral. And in 9/11, the Archbishop of New York said it was not to be played in church. Were 2,300 killed, a lot of them Irish, firemen and what have you. They insisted on playing Rory Dall O'Carolan's piece, which we shall play for us now.